Well, praise the Lord, everybody. We're starting our fourth and final lesson on our burden bearer. As you recall, God is our refuge. The Lord will be our refuge and bring strength and healing to those overtaken with burdens. No matter what we may face in this life, we can be confident God will be near and will help us carry the burdens we have been tasked to bear. For the last 3 weeks, we've gone through the book of Psalms, looking at various verses to see how God does care for us, holds us, encourages us. And today will be no different. We're going to conclude our lessons in Psalm 55, verse 22. Cast thy burden upon the Lord, and he shall sustain thee. He shall never suffer the righteous to be moved. We need to remember that the key to dealing with any present adversity exists in looking to the Lord's ever-present care from what he's done in our past trials, and therefore maintain our absolute faith in Jesus Christ for the present, and to realize he is the reliable bearer of our burdens. Today we're going to look once again at a character who did live, who exemplifies God's hand upon him throughout his life, a man that those who've done any cursory story reading in the Bible would realize and know the life of David. David's life is one that we can look at from beginning to end and see how God was with him through the good times, through the bad times, through the happy times, through the sad times. David's life was one that's well worth studying, for we can see how he handles himself throughout these events. We know how he handled himself as a young shepherd's boy, how he reacted when he was anointed to be the king, and then spent years still guarding sheep, singing to a mad king, running for his life. Finally, David does become the king. One would think he attained the highest honor, the pinnacle of life, and yet tragedy once again befalls his family, partly through David's own sin. Failing to go out to battle one day, he finds himself entangled with a woman that he should not have seen, killing a man, not directly, but ordering this man to war and withdrawing support. But yet we see God's mercy and we see David's angst. We know Psalms 51 where he writes, "Create in me a clean heart." And yet the prophet told David a sword would never leave his family. And once again, in today's study, we're going to see how that sword came to be wielded. David had a son born to her who was not his wife, who died immediately. He knew the hurt of loss, and yet he realized the joys and the balm of forgiveness. He has further children: Ammon, Timrah, Absalom, as well as Solomon. These children grew up in a king's castle, learning what the king had to say, learning about how he was a shepherd. However, his children were far from perfect like any others. For his son Ammon had a crush on his sister, so much so that he could think of nothing else, and in a course of time was able to take advantage of her, and from that point on hated her. His other son, not thinking his father was reacting or doing that which was just, took matters into his own hands and convinced his friends, his brother's friends, to get him drunk and then they smite him. So once again, David sees death in his own family, one brother hating the other, one brother taking advantage of a sister and then hating her. The grief a father must bear when he sees such travesty go into his life. But not wanting to hurt his son, he allowed him to flee to Geshur, and for 3 years was separated from the love, the companionship, the communion with his own son. Finally, after 3 years, time seems to heal all wounds, and Absalom is allowed to come back into the king's presence. But still, David could not look at his son. David would not invite him to the king's table. While he was allowed back into the kingdom, he still was treated as a semi-outsider. Absalom then had the choice of how to react. Would he do well or would he do poorly? Would he spread rumors? Would he raise rebellion? Or would he just accept the fact that at least he's back amongst friends and family? He may not sit where he once was. We know that David paid for the penalty of his sins. We know that God did forgive him, but at a cost. Absalom, too, was paying for his sins. But how did he react to David's benevolence? Absalom, instead of doing as David, penning psalms to a God, crying out to the reliance of the one that he knew from the beginning, instead did what some people would think was just. He went out and sat at the king's gates, and as men would come, he would claim that the king was too busy to listen, but that if he was judge of the land, he would judge justly. He would listen to each and every person, for he himself knew what it was like to not have favor with the king immediately. And in doing so, it seemed that the people's hearts came more to trust Absalom than that of the king. Eventually, David heard of those things that his son had done. It says in Psalms, or in 2 Samuel 15 and 13, there came a messenger to David, saying, the hearts of men of Israel are after Absalom. David now faced rebellion. Not rebellion from without, not a fight from an enemy. For we know David was a warrior. He was able to slay Goliath. He fought many wars. But this time, it was a battle from within. It was one of his own family members, one of his sons. And David had a choice. Was he to crush the rebellion? Was he to kill his own son? Was he to take action? Or was he to do nothing and seem to be weak? David responded by telling his servants to arise and let us flee, for we shall not else escape from Absalom. And they made speed to depart and bring evil upon them and smite them with the city's edge of sword. David simply chose to walk away, even commenting that perhaps the kingdom was being taken from him. He understood that the kingdom was given to him by God and that the kingdom could have been taken from him by God. But in all things, he still had the faith to leave it in God's hands. As David fled, he left behind a trusted advisor, one that would at least give him good favor both in the court of Absalom, but as well as tell him what was going on so that he could keep abreast of that which was happening. As David fled, his mighty men followed him. There were those disgruntled. We remember of times past when he spent time in the cave. It was the disgruntled, the weary, the outcast, the ones that people didn't consider, that wound up becoming loyal and redeemed through David's good nature. Eventually, the battle did come. Absalom chased his father with his newfound allegiance, his army, and Israel. David had his men. And now there came the tipping point, the boiling point, where now father faced son. How would David handle the situation? On David's side, he had his seasoned veterans, his mighty men. He had those that were wise and skilled in warfare against an army of those that simply had their hearts turned towards another, who may have not even considered where their allegiance truly lied. And yet, David still did not want to hurt his son, for he told his three men, Joab, Abishai, and Ittai, to deal gently for his sake with the young man, even Absalom. And then he gave the captain's charge concerning his son. They could put down the rebellion, and they rightfully should, but he did not want his son harmed. Once again, David demonstrated great mercy amongst the betrayal, as he was shown mercy from God. As the armies met, it says in 2 Samuel 18 and 14, then said Joab, I may not tarry thus with thee. And he took 3 darts in his hand and thrust them through the heart of Absalom while he was yet alive in the midst of the oak. Once again, betrayal follows David, and the sword cuts deeper through his family. We cannot always control what happens to us through life. We don't know people's true intent. Here was a clear warning, a clear message. Don't harm my son, even though David had every right to wield the king's power. He had been betrayed, not once, not twice, but thrice through his son Absalom. His son demonstrating that though he was blood to the king, he did not think of the king in familial ways. He was ready to kill his own father. He killed his brother. He raised an army, but yet David continued to extend to him the grace and the mercy that he was showed. David could not control the circumstances of life. From the very beginning of David's upcoming, he started off a mere shepherd's boy, a mere young brother watching sheep on the backside of a mountain, doing his father's bidding, finding one day to be anointed king by the prophet, not fully understanding what that would entail, where that would take him, being told to go find his brothers through a war to bring them lunch, as well as to let his father know the welfare of his children, to then be thrust into face-to-face combat with a man that towered above all men, angry that the insults that were being hurled were not only against Israel, but against the God that he served. To find himself before a mad king playing an instrument that would soothe him, to only be rewarded by having spears thrust at him, to spend his life running in caves, and yet eventually becoming king. Through it all, he learned to trust in God. If you read the Psalms written by David, you clearly see his joys, his sorrows, his angst, his blessings. At each point, he may start with a complaint. He may start with the situation. But by the end of every psalm, he realizes that God has it all in his hands. We would do well to look at how he handled things and perhaps model our lives after. Yes, the tires may be flat, the refrigerator empty, the job not going the way we think, the people around us speaking things that they only have partial knowledge of and shouldn't be speaking at all. But rather than lashing out, which is what most people would and accept, turning it over to the God that sees all, that has promised us the mercies every morning, the blessings of being near us, following us. While we may start off in complaint, letting God know we are upset, we are disgusted, we are not understanding, realizing that God will give us strength, will continue to be on our side. If we look at Psalms 55, it is clearly how David begins in verse 1. Give ear to my prayer, O God, and hide not thyself from my supplication. Attend unto me and hear me. I mourn in my complaint and make a noise because of the voice of the enemy, because of the oppression of the wicked. For they cast iniquity upon me, and in wrath they hate me. My heart is sore pained within me, and the terrors of death are fallen upon me. Fearfulness and trembling are come upon me, and horror hath overwhelmed me. David, like us all, was confused, was hurt, was bitter, was angry, didn't understand. He had every right to voice his feelings. But most of us would stop right there. From that point on, we would go find friends, others, to mourn, to complain, to make noise, to bring about friends that would encourage our misgivings because of the voice of our enemy, casting opinions that others may not have of those that are against us, but coloring their view. He had a right to be pained. He feared that even death would come upon him. There was no guarantee when he fled that Absalom would have not come in the night and treated him differently than he had treated Saul. He was afraid, and he expressed it. He further goes on in the Psalm 12 through 14. For it was not an enemy that reproached me. Then I could have borne it. Neither was it he that hated me that did magnify himself against me. Then I would have hid myself from him. But it was thou, a man, mine equal, my guide, my acquaintance. We took sweet counsel together and walked into the house of God in company. His enemy was not another Goliath or a brother of Goliath. It was not a foreign power or an enemy. He could have justified either battle or fleeing, but this was one that he knew well. Oftentimes, betrayal is a very bitter enemy that comes at us out of what seems to be nowhere. And how we handle the betrayal will determine whether we become a bitter person from that point on or a better person. David was perplexed, for it was his son that betrayed him. His son killed his other brother. His son raised Israel to turn their feelings against him. His son was chasing him down. Betrayal is often our most challenging hurt. How we deal with it will determine where we go. If we look further on, we can see David and how he dealt with it. For in verse 16, it says, "As for me, I will call upon God, and the Lord shall save me." He knew where to turn in his time of trouble. He didn't turn to his wives, though they would have been a help meet to him. He didn't turn to his captains of his army, though they would have gone anywhere he had commanded. He didn't turn to those that followed him, who still believed in him, though they would have listened and rallied. But he went to the source of his strength. He called upon God, knowing that God would save him. In verse 18, he writes, "He hath delivered my soul in peace from the battle that was against me, for there were many with me." He knew where his strength relied. Who knows if during this time, while he's penning this psalm, he's not thinking back to that valley where Israel stood against the Philistines, a giant hurling rails against the God of Israel, making those around him cower. He knew that as he approached this mighty man, warrior, that he was not coming with simple power and strength, but it was with the Spirit of the Lord. He knew from his past that God had kept him. He knew that God had delivered him, and he could further pin that, yes, he was disgruntled. He feared. He had a valid complaint. He knew that his heart was sore, but he could pen, "He hath delivered my soul in peace from the battle that was within me and against me." He knew that though he was surrounded by those he once called allies and friends, that it was God that was his strength in time of need. And then our verse that we read, he reminds himself as well as those now many generations from him that we can read, to cast our burden upon the Lord, and he shall sustain thee. He shall never suffer the righteous to be moved. These words were penned with no guarantee that when the sun rose, David would not be laying with his ancestors. There was no guarantee that his son would take the hand of mercy that he wanted to offer. There was no guarantee that the people would even reinstate him and let him continue being king. But he knew if he put his hands and his trust in God, that God would be able to take him no matter what the morrow brought. Even in the New Testament, we are told by those that knew Christ, Peter writing his letter, casting all our cares upon him, for he cares for you. Or John penning to those that were being hassled and taken as Rome seemed to have its way, writing, and this is the confidence that we have in him, that if we ask anything according to his will, he heareth us. And if we know that he hear us, whatsoever we ask, we know that we have the petitions that we desired of him. The Lord is faithful. He has demonstrated his faithfulness. From Genesis to Revelations, we can clearly see a God who cares for his people, who is there in their daily walk, not maybe up front where we could see, but clearly behind us, before us, around us, lifting us, encouraging us. As we go forth this week, let's remember some of our past trials, some of our past failures, some of our past victories. God is with us, rejoicing with us, encouraging us while we're sitting on that mountain. But oftentimes, we can't stay strictly on the mountain. And life is full of valleys. Life is full of twists. Life is full of turns. Life is full of things that we did not plan for, we did not see. We find ourselves in situations that we never would have willingly walked into. But in those same situations, we could take confidence. Like David, we may start off with complaints, with fears, with wondering, looking at our situation, but yet with confidence can continue on walking with God, knowing that the goodness and the mercy will follow us all the days of our life, and that we too could call upon him and he will save us, that he could deliver our soul in peace from the battle that was against us, that there are more with us than against us, and with full confidence that we too could cast our burden upon the Lord and that he will sustain us. And no matter what the morrow brings, or even what this day has in store, that God is faithful and that we could be carried until our death. Let's remember to come back at 10:15, where we once again will be live to hear what thus saith the word of God, to encourage us, correct us, reprove us, or continue to allow us to walk another step in today, so that we too, like David, would have the confidence that no matter what, we can trust and rely on God to carry our burdens. In Jesus' name.